Obergefreiter Klaus Miller pressed his face against the wire mesh window of the transport truck, his blue eyes widening in disbelief as he watched what appeared to be a young woman in military uniform expertly maneuvering a massive supply truck through the gates of Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The 24-year-old Wehrmacht veteran, captured during the Normandy landings just weeks earlier, had seen many shocking things during his 3 years of military service, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a female driver operating heavy military vehicles with obvious competence and authority. "Unmöglich," he whispered in German, unconsciously gripping the metal bench as the woman downshifted the truck's transmission with the practiced ease of an experienced driver. "That cannot be what it appears to be." Beside him, Feldwebel Hans Richter, a 30-year-old panzer commander from Bavaria whose tank had been destroyed by Allied aircraft near Caen, shook his head in equal amazement. "Klaus, my friend, I think we are not in the world we knew anymore. In the fatherland, women are barely permitted to ride bicycles in public, let alone operate military vehicles." The observation reflected the profound cultural shock that German prisoners were experiencing as they encountered American society for the first time. Having been raised under Nazi ideology that strictly defined gender roles and capabilities, the sight of women performing tasks that German culture reserved exclusively for men challenged fundamental assumptions about social organization and human nature. The telegram that had reached the War Department 3 weeks earlier had outlined the challenges that German POWs would present for American camp administrators. Captured personnel exhibit rigid adherence to National Socialist ideology regarding gender roles and racial hierarchy. Exposure to American democratic values and social organization may prove educationally valuable while requiring careful management of cultural conflicts. Camp Shelby had been selected partly because of its location in the American South, where traditional gender roles might seem less threatening to German prisoners, and partly because of its commanding officer, Colonel Margaret Thompson, whose successful leadership of a major military installation demonstrated American commitment to utilizing all available talent regardless of gender. The woman driving the supply truck was Corporal Betty Sullivan, a farm girl from Iowa whose mechanical aptitude had earned her assignment to the motor pool despite initial resistance from male personnel who doubted women's capabilities with heavy vehicles. Her daily routine of maintaining and operating military trucks, jeeps, and command cars provided constant evidence that American women possessed skills and independence that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible. As the prisoners were processed through the camp's intake procedures, they encountered a systematic challenge to everything they had been taught about appropriate gender roles and capabilities. The medical examination was conducted by Captain Dorothy Martinez, a physician whose professional competence and obvious authority over male medical personnel contradicted German assumptions about women's intellectual limitations. "Guten Tag, Doctor," Martinez said in careful German as she examined Müller's combat injuries from the Normandy fighting. "I hope you understand that you will receive the same medical care as American personnel. We believe in treating all patients with dignity and respect." Müller's response was formal but confused. "Frau Doctor, I do not understand how you can hold such a position of responsibility. In Germany, women are trained for motherhood and domestic duties, not for medical practice or military service." The comment reflected deeply ingrained beliefs about gender roles that had been reinforced through years of Nazi propaganda, emphasizing women's supposed natural limitations and proper spheres of activity. The confrontation with empirical evidence that contradicted these beliefs created cognitive dissonance that would prove difficult for many prisoners to resolve. "Doctor." Martinez's response was patient but firm. "Corporal, medicine requires intelligence, training, and dedication to healing, qualities that have nothing to do with gender. If my skills can help preserve life and restore health, then my sex is irrelevant to my effectiveness as a physician." The conversation provided Müller with his first direct challenge to Nazi gender ideology from someone whose obvious competence made ideological arguments seem foolish. The fact that he was receiving skilled medical care from a woman physician created practical evidence that contradicted theoretical prejudices about female capabilities. The daily routine at Camp Shelby exposed German prisoners to a systematic demonstration of American women's capabilities in roles that Nazi ideology claimed were reserved for men. The motor pool, communications center, supply depot, and administrative offices All included women performing tasks with competence that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and social organization. Staff Sergeant Joyce Anderson, the camp's chief mechanic, provided the most dramatic challenge to German preconceptions about women's capabilities. The Minnesota farm girl could diagnose engine problems by sound, rebuild transmissions from spare parts, and operate any vehicle in the motor pool with skill that exceeded most of her male colleagues. "Mein Gott," Richter murmured to Muller as they watched Anderson directing the repair of a damaged Jeep while simultaneously troubleshooting electrical problems in a command car. "That woman understands machinery better than most panzer mechanics I served with. How is such a thing possible?" The question reflected growing recognition among the prisoners that their preconceptions about gender roles might be fundamentally flawed. The evidence of women's mechanical competence was particularly shocking to men who had been taught that technical skills were inherently masculine traits that women could never master. The Women's Army Corps personnel assigned to guard duty provided additional challenges to German assumptions about female capabilities and proper social roles. Lieutenant Sarah Davis, whose crisp military bearing and obvious authority over male subordinates contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about gender hierarchy, managed security operations with efficiency that impressed even skeptical observers. "These American women conduct themselves like soldiers," noted Gefreiter Wolfgang Schmidt in his carefully hidden diary. "They march in formation, carry weapons, issue orders to men, and receive obedience without question. Yet they remain obviously feminine in appearance and manner. I do not understand how such contradictions can exist within the same person." The observation revealed the conceptual difficulty that German prisoners faced in reconciling empirical evidence of women's capabilities with ideological beliefs about gender roles and social organization. The Nazi worldview provided no framework for understanding competent women who maintained their femininity while performing traditionally masculine roles. The camp's postal service, operated entirely by Women's Army Corps personnel, provided daily evidence of female administrative competence that kept thousands of prisoners connected with families in Germany. The efficiency of mail processing and the obvious care taken to ensure accurate delivery challenged stereotypes about women's organizational abilities and attention to detail. Corporal Mueller's first letter home, written in July 1944, reflected his growing confusion about American gender roles. "Liebe Mutter, the American camp is managed partly by women who wear military uniforms and drive large vehicles like men. I do not understand how such things are permitted, but these women seem competent in their duties. It is very strange to see, but I cannot deny what I observe with my own eyes." The carefully neutral language concealed profound challenges to beliefs about gender roles that Muller had never previously questioned. His growing recognition that women could perform traditionally masculine tasks effectively was forcing him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The medical staff at Camp Shelby included several female physicians, nurses, and technicians whose obvious competence provided daily evidence that contradicted Nazi theories about women's intellectual limitations. Dr. Martinez's successful treatment of combat injuries, infections, and psychological trauma demonstrated medical skills that had saved lives regardless of the gender of the practitioner. The psychological counseling provided by Dr. Eleanor Patterson, a psychiatrist from Boston, whose work with combat trauma had pioneered new treatment methods, provided particularly powerful challenges to German assumptions about women's emotional and intellectual capabilities. Her ability to understand and treat the psychological wounds of warfare demonstrated professional competence that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible for women. "Herr Dr. Patterson," Muller said during one of his counseling sessions, still struggling with the concept of a female physician, "you seem to understand the experiences of soldiers better than many male officers I have served under. How can a woman comprehend the psychological effects of combat, Doctor?" Patterson's response was both professional and educational. "Corporal, human psychology operates according to scientific principles that have nothing to do with the gender of the researcher or practitioner. My ability to help soldiers recover from trauma depends on training, experience, and empathy, qualities that both men and women can develop through proper education." The explanation provided Muller with insights into professional competence that challenged gender stereotypes while demonstrating the practical benefits of utilizing all available human talent, regardless of sex. The evidence that women could excel in fields traditionally reserved for men was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away through ideological reasoning. The camp's recreational activities included baseball games, educational lectures, and cultural events that were often organized and supervised by female personnel whose leadership abilities impressed even skeptical German observers. The sight of women managing complex social and logistical arrangements challenged assumptions about female organizational capabilities. Lieutenant Davis had organized a series of educational programs about American democracy that were designed to challenge prisoners' political beliefs while providing insights into alternative approaches to social organization. Her obvious intellectual sophistication and rhetorical skills demonstrated capabilities that Nazi ideology claimed women could never possess. "In America," she explained to a group of German prisoners during one of her lectures, "we believe that individuals should be judged by their abilities and character rather than their gender or race. Women contribute to society through their talents and efforts, not just through their roles as wives and mothers." The presentation challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles while providing evidence that societies organized around individual merit rather than group characteristics could achieve remarkable success. The prisoners' growing recognition of American military and economic superiority was becoming connected to questions about social organization and gender equality. The correspondence that prisoners maintained with families in Germany began to include observations about American women that would influence German understanding of democratic society and its relationship to female capabilities. These letters, while subject to censorship, conveyed information that challenged Nazi propaganda about American weakness and social decay. Richter's letter to his wife in August 1944 exemplified the confusion that many prisoners were experiencing. "Meine liebe Greta, the American women here perform duties that would be impossible for German women to accomplish. They operate machinery, make important decisions, and command respect from men. I do not know what to think about such things, but I cannot deny that they seem effective in their work." The carefully worded observations reflected growing awareness that American social organization might be more effective than German arrangements for utilizing human resources and achieving collective goals. The implications for post-war reconstruction were beginning to influence prisoners' thinking about alternative approaches to gender roles and social structure. As autumn approached in 1944, the German prisoners at Camp Shelby had been exposed to systematic evidence that challenged every assumption they held about women's capabilities and appropriate social roles. The cognitive dissonance created by observing competent women in positions of authority and responsibility was forcing many to reconsider fundamental beliefs about human nature and social organization. The transformation beginning among the prisoners would accelerate as they gained more exposure to American society and its democratic values. Their journey from rigid gender stereotypes to grudging respect for female competence would provide insights into both the appeal and ultimate failure of Nazi ideology when confronted with evidence of women's actual capabilities and contributions. The autumn of 1944 brought a series of encounters that would forever shatter Obergefreiter Klaus Müller's understanding of what women could accomplish. Standing in the motorpool maintenance bay at Camp Shelby, he watched in fascination as Staff Sergeant Joyce Anderson skillfully rebuilt the transmission of a 2.5-ton cargo truck, her oil-stained hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman while she explained the mechanical principles to a group of male soldiers who listened with obvious respect. "Sie versteht die Maschinen besser als ich," Müller whispered to Feldwebel Richter in amazement. "She understands machines better than I do, and I was trained as a vehicle mechanic in the Wehrmacht." The admission represented a profound crack in the ideological foundation that had shaped Müller's understanding of gender roles and capabilities. His own expertise with mechanical systems, developed through rigorous German military training, seemed inadequate compared to the intuitive understanding that Anderson displayed while diagnosing complex engine problems through subtle sounds and vibrations. Richter's response reflected similar bewilderment. "Klaus, in Germany, we were taught that women lacked the spatial intelligence necessary for mechanical work. Yet this woman operates equipment that our finest mechanics would struggle to master." How can our theories explain such competence? The question haunted both men as they continued to observe American women performing tasks that Nazi ideology claimed were beyond female capabilities. The evidence of their own eyes was creating cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that had never been questioned before their captivity. Dr. Eleanor Patterson had been documenting the psychological impact that exposure to competent women was having on German prisoners, recognizing that their transformation represented more than simple adaptation to circumstances. Her weekly assessments revealed profound challenges to deeply held beliefs about gender roles that were forcing prisoners to reconsider their entire understanding of society and human potential. The German prisoners are experiencing what can only be described as ideological shock, she wrote in her October report. Their exposure to women performing traditionally masculine roles with obvious competence is undermining fundamental assumptions about gender capabilities that form the foundation of Nazi social theory. This crisis may provide opportunities for broader democratic education. The observation reflected growing recognition among American camp administrators that the prisoner work program was serving educational purposes that extended far beyond simple labor utilization. The systematic exposure of German POWs to democratic values and social practices was creating possibilities for ideological transformation that could influence post-war reconstruction efforts. The camp's transportation operations provided daily demonstrations of female competence that impressed even the most skeptical German prisoners. Lieutenant Margaret Foster, a former Detroit assembly line worker whose mechanical aptitude had earned her promotion to motor pool commander, supervised a fleet of vehicles that kept the entire camp functioning with clockwork efficiency. Lieutenant Foster, Muller ventured during one of his assigned work details in the motor pool, how did you learn to operate such complex machinery? In Germany, women are not taught mechanical skills or permitted to drive military vehicles. Foster's response reflected the matter-of-fact approach to gender equality that characterized American military service. Corporal, I grew up working on my father's farm, where everyone learned to repair and operate machinery out of necessity. The Army trained me on military vehicles because I had the aptitude and interest. Practical results matter more than theoretical limitations. The explanation provided Muller with insights into American social organization that challenged German assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. The idea that practical competence rather than theoretical prejudice should determine individual opportunities represented a different approach to human resource utilization that seemed to produce superior results. The camp's communications center, operated entirely by Women's Army Corps personnel, provided another source of amazement for prisoners who had been taught that women lacked the technical skills necessary for complex electronic systems. The radio operators who maintained contact with military headquarters and coordinated supply deliveries demonstrated expertise that exceeded anything Muller had observed in German communications units. Corporal Susan Wright, whose technical knowledge of radio frequency management and signal processing had made her indispensable for camp operations, represented capabilities that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible for women to develop. Her ability to troubleshoot equipment failures and optimize communication networks demonstrated scientific understanding that challenged fundamental assumptions about female intellectual limitations. Corporal Wright, Richter asked, during one of his work assignments in the communications center, "Your technical knowledge appears very advanced. How did American women acquire such skills when German women are taught that electronics and radio work are too complex for feminine minds?" Wright's patient explanation revealed the systematic approach that American society took toward developing human potential regardless of gender. "Sergeant, I studied electrical engineering at the University of Michigan before the war. Women can learn anything that interests them if they're given proper education and opportunities. Intelligence has nothing to do with sex." The conversation provided Richter with evidence that contradicted everything he had been taught about gender and intellectual capability. The systematic exclusion of women from technical education in Germany was beginning to appear not as protection of natural order, but as deliberate waste of human resources that weakened rather than strengthened society. The administrative operations at Camp Shelby demonstrated female organizational competence that kept thousands of prisoners housed, fed and managed with efficiency that impressed professional soldiers trained in military logistics. Captain Dorothy Hamilton, whose administrative systems had become models for other POW camps, supervised complex operations that required strategic thinking and tactical execution. The prisoner records, supply coordination, medical scheduling and recreational programming that Hamilton managed represented organizational challenges that German military doctrine claimed required masculine leadership and analytical thinking. Her obvious success in coordinating multiple complex systems simultaneously challenged assumptions about female capabilities that formed the foundation of Nazi social theory. Müller's work assignment in the camp administration office provided direct exposure to American organizational methods that utilized female personnel in positions of significant responsibility and authority. The sight of women making important decisions, managing budgets and supervising male subordinates contradicted everything he had been taught about proper gender roles and social hierarchy. Hauptmann Hamilton, he observed during one of their interactions, "Your administrative systems are more efficient than anything I encountered in the German army. How can women possess such organizational abilities when we were taught that complex planning requires masculine analytical thinking?" Hamilton's response reflected confidence in democratic principles that had been tested and proven effective. Corporal, organizational success depends on attention to detail, systematic thinking, and effective communication, qualities that both men and women can develop through proper training. We use the best available talent regardless of gender, because practical results matter more than ideological prejudices. The explanation provided Müller with insights into democratic efficiency that challenged Nazi assumptions about the relationship between gender roles and organizational effectiveness. The evidence that inclusive societies achieved better results than exclusive ones was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away through ideological reasoning. The medical operations at Camp Shelby provided the most dramatic evidence of female professional competence that German prisoners encountered during their captivity. Dr. Martinez's surgical skills, Dr. Patterson's psychological expertise, and the nursing staff's clinical knowledge demonstrated medical capabilities that saved lives regardless of the gender of the practitioners. The sight of women performing complex surgical procedures, diagnosing psychological disorders, and managing critical care situations challenged fundamental assumptions about female intellectual and emotional capabilities that Nazi ideology had promoted as scientific fact. The empirical evidence of women's medical competence was forcing prisoners to reconsider basic beliefs about human nature and social organization. Gefreiter Schmidt, whose combat injuries had required extensive surgical treatment by Dr. Martinez, found himself struggling to reconcile his recovery with his beliefs about gender roles. "She saved my life," he confided to Müller during one of their evening conversations. "Her surgical skill exceeded that of male doctors who treated me in Germany. How can our theories explain such competence from someone we were taught was intellectually inferior?" The question reflected the broader intellectual crisis that many German prisoners were experiencing as their exposure to competent women undermined fundamental assumptions about gender and society. The cognitive dissonance created by observing female capabilities that contradicted Nazi theory was forcing systematic reconsideration of beliefs that had never been questioned before captivity. The letters that prisoners wrote to families in Germany began to include observations about American women that would influence German understanding of democratic society and its relationship to gender equality. These communications, while subject to military censorship, conveyed information that challenged Nazi propaganda about American social decay and female weakness. Müller's letter to his sister in November 1944 exemplified the confusion that many prisoners were experiencing. "Liebe Anna, the American women here perform duties that would be impossible for German women to accomplish. They repair machinery, lead soldiers, practice medicine, and manage complex operations with competence that exceeds many men. I do not understand how such things can be, but I cannot deny what I observe daily." The carefully worded observations reflected growing awareness that American social organization might be more effective than German arrangements for utilizing human resources and achieving collective goals. The implications for post-war reconstruction were beginning to influence prisoners' thinking about alternative approaches to gender roles and social structure. The recreational activities organized by female personnel provided additional evidence of women's leadership capabilities and organizational skills. Lieutenant Davis's educational programs, Corporal Anderson's mechanical training sessions, and Dr. Patterson's counseling groups demonstrated competence in areas that Nazi ideology claimed were reserved for masculine authority. The success of these programs in maintaining prisoner morale while providing valuable education about democratic society showed that women could excel in leadership roles when given appropriate opportunities and support. The systematic exclusion of women from similar positions in German society was beginning to appear as deliberate waste of human potential rather than protection of natural order. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the German prisoners at Camp Shelby had accumulated overwhelming evidence that challenged every assumption they held about women's capabilities and appropriate social roles. The cognitive transformation occurring among the prisoners would accelerate as news of Germany's collapse forced them to reconsider fundamental questions about social organization and human potential. The relationships developing between prisoners and female personnel had begun to transcend official frameworks to create personal connections that demonstrated possibilities for mutual respect and understanding between men and women working as equals. These interactions provided models for gender relations that could influence post-war reconstruction of German society along more democratic and inclusive lines. The knowledge gained through exposure to competent women in positions of authority and responsibility would prove valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts as German society faced the necessity of rebuilding social institutions that could compete effectively with democratic alternatives. The prisoners' transformation from rigid gender stereotypes to grudging respect for female capabilities represented the beginning of broader social changes that would reshape European society in the post-war period. The spring of 1945 brought news of Germany's impending collapse that forced the prisoners at Camp Shelby to confront not only military defeat, but also the intellectual crisis that months of exposure to competent American women had created in their understanding of society and human potential. Obergefreiter Klaus Miller stood in the camp's workshop, watching Staff Sergeant Joyce Anderson train a group of male mechanics in advanced engine diagnostics, while he struggled to reconcile her obvious expertise with everything he had been taught about gender roles and capabilities. Anderson weiß mehr als unsere besten Mechaniker, Möller admitted to Feldwebel Richter, finally acknowledging what had become undeniable through months of observation. Anderson knows more than our best mechanics. Her understanding of machinery surpasses anything I learned in Wehrmacht technical training. The admission represented complete abandonment of Nazi ideology regarding female capabilities, forced by overwhelming evidence that women could excel in fields that German theory claimed were reserved for masculine intelligence. Müller's intellectual honesty was compelling him to accept empirical reality, despite its implications for everything he had previously believed about society and human nature. Richter's response reflected similar transformation. Klaus, I have been corresponding with my wife about what we have observed here. She writes that German women are beginning to work in factories and technical positions out of necessity. Perhaps this American approach to utilizing female capabilities represents our future, rather than an aberration we can dismiss. The conversation revealed growing recognition among the prisoners that their exposure to American gender equality was not merely a temporary anomaly, but a preview of social changes that would reshape European society in the post-war period. The practical advantages of utilizing all available human talent were becoming impossible to ignore as Germany faced the necessity of reconstruction with depleted male population. Dr. Eleanor Patterson had documented remarkable changes in prisoner attitudes toward women and gender roles that exceeded anything achieved through conventional therapeutic interventions. Her final assessments revealed profound transformation in beliefs that had been considered immutable aspects of Nazi ideological conditioning. The German prisoners have undergone what can only be described as a complete conversion regarding gender capabilities, she wrote in her comprehensive report. Their exposure to competent women in positions of authority has systematically undermined fundamental assumptions about female limitations that formed the foundation of Nazi social theory. This transformation appears genuine and permanent, based on empirical evidence rather than ideological pressure. The psychological research conducted through the prisoner program would influence post-war approaches to denazification and democratic education throughout occupied Germany. The evidence that sustained exposure to democratic practices could produce genuine ideological transformation provided hope for broader social reconstruction based on inclusion rather than exclusion. The news of President Roosevelt's death in April 1945 created an opportunity for German prisoners to observe American women's responses to national crisis that further challenged their assumptions about female emotional capabilities and political understanding. The dignified grief and continued competence displayed by female personnel contradicted stereotypes about women's supposed emotional instability and political ignorance. Lieutenant Margaret Foster's management of transportation operations during the period of national mourning demonstrated leadership capabilities that maintained essential services while allowing appropriate recognition of the nation's loss. Her ability to balance emotional sensitivity with operational effectiveness challenged German assumptions about the incompatibility of feminine qualities with leadership responsibility. Die amerikanischen Frauen verstehen Politik und Führung, Möller observed to Dr. Patterson during one of their counseling sessions. The American women understand politics and leadership in ways that our theories claimed were impossible. They respond to crisis with competence rather than hysteria. The observation reflected broader recognition among prisoners that American women possessed political sophistication and emotional maturity that contradicted Nazi propaganda about democratic society's alleged weakness and female incapacity. The systematic exclusion of women from German political life was beginning to appear as deliberate waste of human insight rather than protection of natural order. The camp's medical staff continued to provide daily evidence of female professional competence that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and intellectual capability. Dr. Martinez's research on combat trauma treatment had produced innovations that were being adopted by military medical facilities throughout the theater, demonstrating scientific achievement that Nazi ideology claimed was beyond female intellectual capacity. The surgical techniques she had developed for treating complex wound patterns, the psychological treatment protocols she had designed for combat stress, and the organizational systems she had created for efficient medical care represented contributions to military medicine that exceeded anything produced by comparable German medical personnel during the war. Frau Dr. Martinez, Schmidt ventured during one of his follow-up medical appointments, your medical innovations have been more effective than treatments I received from German military physicians. How can women possess such scientific and medical capabilities when we were taught that complex reasoning was beyond feminine intellectual capacity? Dr. Martinez's patient explanation revealed the systematic approach that American society took toward developing human potential. Corporal, medical science operates according to objective principles that have nothing to do with the gender of the researcher or practitioner. My contributions to military medicine result from training, experience, and scientific method, qualities that both men and women can develop through proper education and opportunity. The conversation provided Schmidt with insights into democratic meritocracy that challenged Nazi assumptions about the relationship between gender and intellectual achievement. The evidence that women could excel in scientific fields when given appropriate opportunities was forcing systematic reconsideration of beliefs about human nature and social organization. The correspondence that prisoners maintained with families in Germany began to include explicit recommendations about post-war social organization that reflected their transformed understanding of gender roles and capabilities. These letters would influence German reconstruction efforts by providing first-hand testimony about the practical advantages of gender equality. Müller's letter to his mother in May 1945 represented a complete transformation in his thinking about women and society. Liebe Mutter, I must tell you honestly that everything we believed about women's limitations was wrong. The American women here demonstrate capabilities in mechanics, medicine, leadership, and organization that exceed most men. Germany's future reconstruction must utilize all our human resources, including women's talents that we have systematically ignored. The frank admission would prove controversial among German families struggling with defeat and social upheaval, but it represented genuine conversion based on empirical evidence rather than ideological pressure. The prisoner's testimony about American gender equality would influence post-war German attitudes toward women's roles and capabilities. The final months of the war provided opportunities for German prisoners to observe American women's responses to victory that further challenged stereotypes about female character and capabilities. The dignified celebration and continued professionalism displayed by female personnel contradicted assumptions about women's supposed emotional instability and inability to maintain perspective during significant events. Captain Dorothy Hamilton's management of victory celebrations, while maintaining essential camp operations, demonstrated organizational capabilities that balanced emotional satisfaction with operational requirements. Her ability to coordinate complex logistics during a period of intense emotion challenged German assumptions about the incompatibility of feminine sensitivity with administrative responsibility. The educational programs that female personnel had organized throughout the prisoners' captivity culminated in comprehensive presentations about American democracy and its relationship to gender equality that provided theoretical frameworks for understanding the practical advantages they had observed. These sessions connected their empirical observations to broader principles of social organization. Lieutenant Davis's final lecture series on democratic theory addressed questions about gender roles and social organization that directly challenged Nazi ideology while providing alternative frameworks for understanding human potential and social effectiveness. Her intellectual sophistication and rhetorical skills demonstrated capabilities that German theory claimed women could never possess. In democratic societies, she explained to assembled prisoners, we believe that individuals should be judged by their abilities and contributions rather than their gender, race, or social background. Women contribute to society through their talents and efforts, earning respect through competence rather than accepting limitations through prejudice. The presentation provided intellectual tools for understanding American success that connected gender equality to broader questions of social organization and national effectiveness. The prisoners' growing recognition of American superiority was becoming inseparable from questions about inclusive versus exclusive approaches to human resource utilization. The repatriation process that began in summer 1945 created opportunities for German prisoners to carry their transformed understanding of gender roles back to a homeland that would need to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its social institutions. Their conversion from rigid gender stereotypes to respect for female capabilities positioned them to contribute to democratic reconstruction efforts. The documentation that prisoners had compiled about American women's capabilities would provide evidence for post-war arguments about the practical advantages of gender equality in social and economic reconstruction. Their systematic observations of female competence in traditionally masculine roles offered models for German society, facing labor shortages and social reconstruction challenges. Mueller's decision to document his observations about American women in a comprehensive journal that he planned to share with German Reconstruction authorities reflected understanding that gender equality represented practical necessity rather than ideological luxury for societies facing modern challenges. His military training had taught him to analyze enemy capabilities objectively, and the evidence suggested that inclusive societies possessed systematic advantages over exclusive ones. The American utilization of female capabilities in mechanical, medical, administrative, and leadership roles provides them with access to human resources that Germany has systematically excluded through prejudice, he wrote in his summary analysis. Our future reconstruction must abandon ideological limitations on human potential in favor of practical approaches that utilize all available talent, regardless of gender. The systematic documentation that German prisoners had compiled about American gender equality would influence post-war reconstruction policies by providing empirical evidence that contradicted Nazi ideology while demonstrating practical alternatives for social organization. Their transformation from ideological true believers to empirical observers would prove valuable for building democratic institutions in occupied Germany. As the prisoners prepared for repatriation in late 1945, their relationships with American female personnel had evolved from shocked disbelief through grudging respect to genuine admiration for competence and character that transcended gender categories. These personal connections had created understanding of democratic values that went beyond theoretical knowledge to encompass emotional appreciation for human dignity and potential. The farewell ceremonies organized by female personnel provided final demonstrations of organizational competence and emotional intelligence that left lasting impressions on departing prisoners. The dignity and professionalism displayed during these events reinforced lessons about gender equality, while creating positive memories that would influence post-war attitudes toward democratic values and social organization. Mueller's farewell conversation with Staff Sergeant Anderson encapsulated the transformation that had occurred during his captivity. "Sergeant Anderson, you have taught me that competence has no gender, that talent transcends prejudice, and that societies that utilize all their human resources will always be stronger than those that waste potential through fear and hatred. I will carry these lessons back to Germany." Anderson's response reflected the hope that democratic education could contribute to post-war reconciliation and reconstruction. "Corporal Muller, I hope that what you've learned here will help Germany build a society that gives everyone the opportunity to contribute their talents. The world will be safer when all nations respect human dignity and potential." The exchange represented more than polite farewell between former enemies. It embodied possibilities for international cooperation based on shared democratic values that could prevent future conflicts while promoting human development and social progress. The seeds of change planted through exposure to American gender equality would grow into broader transformation of European society in the post-war period. The autumn of 1945 brought Obergefreiter Klaus Müller back to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he had left 3 years earlier. Standing amid the rubble of his hometown of Stuttgart, watching German women operate heavy machinery to clear debris while managing construction crews with obvious competence, he realized that the transformation he had experienced in American captivity was becoming reality throughout his homeland out of sheer necessity for survival. "Es ist wie in America," he murmured to himself, observing a female engineer directing the reconstruction of a bombed bridge with the same authoritative competence he had witnessed from American women at Camp Shelby. "It is like in America. The women here are doing what we thought was impossible." The observation reflected more than simple recognition of wartime expedients. It represented understanding that the gender equality he had observed in American prisoner camps might represent the future of modern society rather than a temporary aberration. The practical necessity of utilizing all available human resources for reconstruction was forcing German society to abandon ideological limitations that had constrained half its population. Feldwebel Hans Richter, who had returned to Bavaria to find his wife managing the family farm with mechanical and organizational skills that exceeded anything he had previously imagined women could possess, wrote to Müller describing similar transformations occurring throughout rural Germany. "Klaus, meine Frau operates our tractor better than I ever did, has increased our production through scientific methods, and coordinates with other farms in ways that remind me of American organizational efficiency. The women here have become what the American women already were." The correspondence between former prisoners revealed widespread recognition that their exposure to American gender equality had provided preview of social changes that were reshaping European society regardless of ideological preferences. The practical advantages of utilizing female capabilities were becoming impossible to ignore as Germany faced massive reconstruction challenges with severely depleted male population. Dr. Eleanor Patterson had continued to track the post-war experiences of German prisoners who had undergone ideological transformation during their American captivity. Her follow-up studies revealed that exposure to competent women in positions of authority had produced lasting changes in attitudes toward gender roles that influenced both personal behavior and professional recommendations. The former prisoners consistently report that their American experiences fundamentally altered their understanding of women's capabilities and appropriate social roles, she wrote in her post-war assessment. They demonstrate significantly more progressive attitudes toward gender equality than control groups who did not experience similar exposure to competent women in positions of authority. The research provided empirical evidence that sustained exposure to democratic practices could produce genuine ideological transformation that influenced post-war reconstruction efforts. The systematic documentation of attitude changes among former prisoners would influence American policies toward denazification and democratic education throughout occupied Germany. Mueller's work with Reconstruction authorities in the American occupation zone reflected his transformed understanding of gender roles and their relationship to social effectiveness. His recommendations for utilizing female personnel in technical and administrative positions drew directly from observations of American women's capabilities during his captivity. The American utilization of women in mechanical, medical, and administrative roles provided them with access to human resources that Germany must now employ out of necessity, he wrote in his official report to military government authorities. Our reconstruction efforts should abandon ideological limitations on female participation in favor of practical approaches that utilize all available talent. The systematic documentation that former prisoners provided about American gender equality influenced occupation policies by demonstrating practical alternatives to Nazi social organization. Their testimony about women's capabilities in traditionally masculine roles provided evidence for arguments about the advantages of inclusive, over-exclusive approaches to human resource utilization. The relationships that former prisoners had developed with American women during their captivity continued through correspondence that provided ongoing channels for cultural exchange and democratic education. These personal connections created networks of understanding that facilitated Germany's integration into Western democratic institutions while promoting progressive attitudes toward gender equality. Staff Sergeant Joyce Anderson's letters to Mueller, which continued throughout his involvement in reconstruction efforts, provided ongoing education about democratic values and their practical applications. Her descriptions of post-war American society and women's expanding roles in civilian life offered models for German reconstruction that emphasized inclusion and opportunity. Klaus, American women are moving into fields that were closed to them before the war: engineering, business management, scientific research, political leadership, she wrote in one of her regular updates. The war showed that women could handle any responsibility when given the opportunity. I hope Germany will learn the same lesson and build a society that uses everyone's talents. The correspondence provided former prisoners with continuing exposure to democratic values that reinforced lessons learned during captivity, while offering practical guidance for implementing gender equality in post-war reconstruction. These personal relationships demonstrated possibilities for international cooperation based on shared commitment to human dignity and potential. The educational programs that former prisoners organized for German reconstruction personnel drew heavily on their American experiences to demonstrate the practical advantages of gender equality for social and economic development. Mueller's training sessions for construction supervisors included systematic presentations about women's mechanical capabilities based on his observations of Staff Sergeant Anderson's expertise. I have witnessed women operating complex machinery with competence that exceeded male technicians, he told skeptical German engineers who questioned proposals to employ female workers in technical positions. American women rebuilt engines, managed motor pools, and supervised maintenance operations with efficiency that contributed directly to Allied victory. Germany's reconstruction requires similar utilization of all available human resources. The presentations provided practical evidence that challenged traditional German assumptions about gender roles while demonstrating concrete benefits of inclusive employment policies. The systematic documentation of American women's capabilities offered models for German reconstruction that emphasized merit over prejudice in personnel decisions. Richter's work with agricultural reconstruction in Bavaria reflected similar application of lessons learned through exposure to American gender equality. His wife's demonstrated capabilities in farm management had convinced him that rural reconstruction required systematic utilization of women's organizational and technical skills, rather than relegation to traditional domestic roles. Die amerikanischen Frauen haben uns gezeigt, was möglich ist, he explained to local farming cooperatives that were debating women's participation in technical training programs. The American women showed us what is possible when societies utilize all available talent. Our agricultural recovery depends on adopting similar approaches to human resource development. The advocacy by former prisoners for expanded women's roles in Reconstruction reflected genuine conviction based on empirical evidence rather than ideological conversion under pressure. Their systematic observations of female competence in American society provided credible testimony that influenced German attitudes toward gender equality and social organization. The women's organizations that emerged in post-war Germany found valuable allies among former prisoners who had witnessed firsthand the practical advantages of gender equality in American society. These men's testimony about women's capabilities provided credible support for arguments about expanded female participation in professional and political life. Frau Elisabeth Schwarzhaupt, who would later become Germany's first female cabinet minister, cited former prisoners' testimony about American women's capabilities in her arguments for expanded educational and professional opportunities for German women. Their empirical observations provided evidence that contradicted traditional assumptions about female limitations while demonstrating successful models of gender equality. The American examples documented by returning prisoners prove that women can excel in any field when given appropriate opportunities, she argued in her advocacy for educational reform. Germany's future competitiveness requires utilizing all our human potential rather than constraining half our population through outdated prejudices. The political influence of former prisoners' testimony about American gender equality contributed to the progressive provisions regarding women's rights that were incorporated into West Germany's Basic Law in 1949. Their systematic documentation of female competence in traditionally masculine roles provided evidence for arguments about the practical necessity of gender equality in modern democratic societies. Muller's involvement in drafting employment policies for the new Federal Republic reflected his transformed understanding of gender roles and their relationship to economic efficiency. His recommendations for eliminating gender-based restrictions on professional opportunities drew directly from observations of American women's contributions to wartime production and military effectiveness. Democratic societies that utilize all available human talent will consistently outperform those that constrain potential through prejudice, he wrote in his policy recommendations. Germany's competition with other democratic nations requires abandoning ideological limitations on women's participation in favor of merit-based approaches to human resource utilization. The systematic integration of gender equality principles into West German Reconstruction policies reflected broader influence of democratic education that had been provided through prisoner programs. The evidence that former enemies could genuinely convert to democratic values provided hope for comprehensive social transformation that would prevent future conflicts. The business enterprises that former prisoners established in post-war Germany often demonstrated progressive approaches to gender equality that reflected lessons learned through exposure to American organizational methods. Muller's Construction Company, founded in 1947, employed female engineers and supervisors in positions of significant responsibility that challenged traditional German business practices. My American experiences taught me that competence has no gender, he explained to business associates who questioned his employment policies. Women engineers and supervisors contribute capabilities that strengthen rather than weaken our organizational effectiveness. Practical results matter more than traditional prejudices. The success of businesses that employed women in non-traditional roles provided evidence that gender equality offered competitive advantages in post-war economic development. The systematic demonstration of female competence in technical and managerial positions influenced broader German attitudes toward women's capabilities and appropriate social roles. The correspondence that continued between former prisoners and American women who had supervised them during captivity provided ongoing education about democratic values and their practical applications in post-war society. These personal relationships created networks of cultural exchange that facilitated Germany's integration into Western democratic institutions. Dr. Dorothy Martinez's letters to Schmidt, who had become a medical administrator in Hamburg, provided continuing education about healthcare organization and the integration of female medical professionals into positions of leadership and responsibility. Her descriptions of post-war medical education and professional opportunities offered models for German healthcare reconstruction. The war demonstrated that medical care improves when all qualified personnel are utilized, regardless of gender. She wrote in response to Schmidt's questions about organizing medical education programs. Germany's healthcare reconstruction should emphasize competence and training, rather than traditional limitations on women's professional opportunities. Fürstenrieti, the ongoing correspondence, provided former prisoners with practical guidance for implementing gender equality in post-war reconstruction while reinforcing lessons learned during captivity. These personal relationships demonstrated possibilities for international cooperation based on shared commitment to democratic values and human development. The academic studies that eventually emerged from the prisoner program documented the effectiveness of experiential education in producing genuine ideological transformation. Mueller's collaboration with American researchers on studies of attitude change provided evidence that sustained exposure to democratic practices could overcome even the most comprehensive ideological conditioning. My transformation from rigid Nazi ideology to democratic conviction was not the result of propaganda or coercion, he testified in post-war interviews. It was the inevitable consequence of observing empirical evidence that women could excel in any field when given appropriate opportunities. Reality has a way of overcoming prejudice when people are honest about what they observe. The systematic documentation of ideological transformation among former prisoners influenced post-war policies toward denazification and democratic education throughout occupied Germany. The evidence that sustained exposure to democratic practices could produce genuine conversion provided hope for comprehensive social reconstruction based on inclusion rather than exclusion. By 1960, the former prisoners who had experienced American gender equality during their captivity had become influential advocates for women's rights and democratic values throughout German society. Their testimony about the practical advantages of gender equality had contributed to social changes that transformed West Germany into one of Europe's most progressive societies regarding women's opportunities and rights. Müller's memoir, published in 1965, provided systematic analysis of his transformation from Nazi ideology to democratic conviction through exposure to American women's capabilities. Witnessing Competence, a German soldier's education in democracy, became required reading in German universities for students studying social change and democratic development. The American women who supervised my captivity taught me that human potential transcends artificial limitations imposed by prejudice and ideology, he wrote in his conclusion. Their competence in mechanical, medical, administrative, and leadership roles demonstrated that societies utilizing all available talent will always surpass those constrained by fear and hatred. This lesson transformed not only my understanding of gender, but my entire approach to human dignity and social organization. The book's influence on German educational policy reflected broader recognition that democratic values required practical demonstration rather than theoretical instruction. The systematic documentation of American women's capabilities provided evidence that influenced curriculum development and teacher training throughout the German educational system. Richter's work with agricultural education reflected similar application of lessons learned through exposure to democratic gender equality. His development of co-educational technical training programs drew directly from observations of American women's mechanical and organizational capabilities during his captivity. Agricultural modernization requires utilizing all available human intelligence and capability, he explained to traditional farmers who resisted including women in technical training programs. American agricultural efficiency demonstrated that societies limiting women's participation constrain their own productivity and competitiveness. The success of educational programs that included women in technical and scientific training provided evidence that gender equality offered practical advantages for economic development. The systematic demonstration of female capabilities in previously masculine fields influenced broader German attitudes toward women's potential and appropriate social roles. The international relationships that former prisoners maintained with American women who had supervised them during captivity continued to influence German-American cooperation throughout the Cold War period. These personal connections created networks of understanding that facilitated political and military cooperation while promoting democratic values and human rights. The NATO alliance represented for many former prisoners the international extension of democratic principles they had learned to respect during American captivity. Mueller's work with military cooperation programs reflected understanding that democratic alliances based on shared values could achieve collective security while preserving individual nations' sovereignty and dignity. The American women who taught me about democratic values during my captivity showed me that strength comes from inclusion rather than exclusion, he explained to German military personnel participating in NATO training programs. Democratic alliances succeed because they harness diversity rather than fearing it. The influence of gender equality lessons learned during prisoner programs extended beyond immediate post-war reconstruction to shape German society's approach to women's rights and opportunities throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The systematic evidence that former prisoners had compiled about American women's capabilities provided foundations for progressive policies that made West Germany a leader in European gender equality initiatives. By 1975, 30 years after their return from American captivity, the former prisoners who had experienced democratic gender equality had become elder statesmen whose testimony influenced German approaches to education, employment, and social policy. Their transformation from Nazi ideology to democratic conviction provided evidence that comprehensive social change was possible through sustained exposure to superior alternative models of human organization. The legacy of their experience extended beyond individual transformation to influence broader understanding of democratic education and social reconstruction. Their systematic documentation of American women's capabilities during World War II provided historical evidence that informed contemporary debates about gender equality and human potential throughout European society. Muller's final letter to Staff Sergeant Anderson, written shortly before his death in 1989, captured the lasting significance of his transformation. Joyce, you taught me 45 years ago that competence has no gender, that talent transcends prejudice, and that societies utilizing all their human resources will always be stronger than those that waste potential through fear. These lessons shaped not only my personal life but Germany's post-war development. The democratic values you demonstrated during my captivity became the foundation for everything I tried to build in my homeland. The correspondence represented more than personal gratitude. It embodied recognition that democratic education through practical demonstration could transform even the most rigid ideological conditioning. The seeds of change planted through exposure to American gender equality had grown into comprehensive transformation of German society that continued to influence European development decades after the original encounters. The remarkable story of German POWs encountering women drivers and mechanics in American camps reveals one of World War II's most profound challenges to Nazi ideology. These soldiers, raised under rigid gender roles that defined women as intellectually and physically inferior, witnessed firsthand the competence and authority of American women operating complex machinery and managing military operations. From their initial shock at seeing women driving trucks and repairing engines to their eventual recognition that gender equality represented a source of democratic strength, these prisoners underwent a complete intellectual transformation that would reshape their understanding of human potential and social organization. The women who challenged their prejudices through simple competence planted seeds of change that would influence Germany's post-war reconstruction and democratic development. What surprised you most about how quickly these German soldiers began to respect the American women's capabilities? Could you imagine such a complete transformation in thinking about gender roles happening so rapidly? Share your thoughts in the comments about how practical demonstration can be more powerful than theoretical arguments in changing deeply held beliefs. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button for more incredible stories of how individual encounters with equality changed the course of history.